Hello, and welcome to episode 534 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my co-host, author, historian, good buddy, John Parshall. How are you this Veterans Day, November 11th, John?
Honestly, I'm dog tired because I didn't sleep worth a damn last night. But we've got there's nothing like a good route, in a battle to perk me up. So I'm looking forward to this. Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
today is that day, isn't it?
it is that day. Yeah, and okay, so I need to do a couple of shout outs here.
Grant.
I was at a conference, a history conference, the America's History LLC conference in Richmond, Virginia. And there were a couple of folks there that were viewers of the podcast, and it was a good show actually. I was there with John McManus, I was there with Craig Simons, David Dean Barrett was there talking about his Hiroshima book. The other thing I wanted to say was that I screwed up a book signing out there, so which I
Wow. How could
okay. So I had dinner the night before with John McManus, and he had a
you?
friend there named Mike, and it was great little dinner, the three of us. And then the next day, during the lunch break, somebody came up to me with a book, and he wanted it signed, and his name was Mike. And I couldn't. I'm terrible with names and faces, and I was just like,
Mm.
I think this is the same Mike. And so I signed Mike's book. Mike, great to meet you in Virginia. Thank you so much for dinner last night. And then I handed him the book, and I said, thanks for dinner last night. And he gave me this kind of, bizarre looking like, uh-oh. And I didn't admit to it then because I was so embarrassed. But anyway, Mike, Mike 2, if you're out there, you now have a rare effed up copy with my signature on it. I'm so sorry for confusing you with Mike 1. But thank you for coming out anyway. So that was my
That
weekend.
is awesome.
And I'm super paranoid about that too, because when people want me to sign a book, I'm like religious about. I look at their name tag. I'm like, are you Thomas or Tom? Because I
Sure,
don't want to mess up. They've spent good money for this stupid book.
sure.
So yeah, I feel pretty sheepish about that. But anyway, there you go.
Hey
Sorry,
man, that
Mike.
don't you're not the Lone Ranger. My superpower is meeting you and then 30 seconds later forgetting your name.
Oh
And
yeah,
it is nothing personal. It's
yeah.
not
I'm
like,
terrible with that.
the big-headed historian is like, no,
No.
I honestly don't remember your name. I'm sorry. There's only so
Yeah.
much I can remember, and unfortunately, names are not
Yes.
among them.
Yeah.
So, oh hey,
Finite
just
brain cells. All right, let's do it.
exactly before we get on to it real quick too. Speaking of taking the show on the road per se, uh, there's a very good potential, I think, John, you know this, about us returning to the central north, I guess, north central Texas area
Yeah.
for another sort of Q&A kind of thing up around Dallas at the Greenville.
Yeah.
Oh, geez, Louise, those
It's the
guys.
Audie Murphy World War II History Roundtable. Yeah, in
See what I mean?
Greenville, Texas. Yeah,
Can't remember names.
yeah,
We're still working out the dates, but just FYI, it that may more than likely occur probably in the early part of the summer. I would think,
yeah.
June-ish ish.
After my 42 book comes out.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, all right.
Anyway,
Now, on with the topic. All right. So,
yes, sir. Let's do it.
home to over a million citizens of many different nationalities. The westernized Asian metropolis was a stylish locale for the well-to-do Brits, Europeans, and Americans in the 1920s and 30s, seen as a vital position for the British in their colonial empire in the southeastern Asian realm. Singapore was always touted as the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Throughout the 30s, the British saw Singapore as a potential deterrent, a threat, if you will, to any further Japanese expansion ideas in the region. The British felt that the naval base would and eventually did build on the island was imperative to their colonial ambitions of defense in the region. Main fleet to Singapore was the common saying of the day. Yet, as we know, there was no main fleet available to send to Singapore, and any realistic thoughts on the fortress holding out in the tight economic times of the Great Depression were, as has been said, a strategic delusion. The so-called fortress, the linchpin of British defense in the region on which Winston Churchill threw hopes and thousands of poor saps bound to be POWs of the empire, was nothing more than a paper tiger. By February 1942, that paper tiger was a crumbled pile of, as subjects of the crown often say, rubbish. Having destroyed the causeway that connected Malaya to the island of Singapore, the fortress and the city itself was now isolated. Yamashita's 25th Army, victorious in nearly every action it had fought thus far, sat across the Straits of Johore like a real, honest-to-God, panting tiger, claws out, teeth bared, ready to pounce upon its final victim, the Gibraltar of dashed British strategy, Singapore.
Mm.
Boom. Ba-ba-ba. This
So
is
bad.
a talk about a route. This is a route.
Yeah, so bad. It's just so bad. Um, yeah, and actually before we even get into it, I did want to just throw up some books here. I draw on Brian Farrell's book extensively in my 42 tome. And you can tell it's a good book when it's like jammed full of, post-it notes, because that's how I take notes. And of course, the other one, we already talked about this last episode, H.P. Wilmot, Empires in the Balance. This book is so good. I remember the first time I read this thing when I was in my early 30s, and just his writing is brilliant. He was brilliant, and so scathing and so funny too. Just it even now it stands up really really well. Although Wilmot was an interesting character in and of himself, sort of a kind of a tragic figure actually in a way, but yeah, one of those guys who was so brilliant that it was not necessarily good for him, at least in terms of securing long-term employment, because he had apparently, according to my mentor Mark Peaty, who knew him pretty well, he was like, yeah, Ned really couldn't help but tell his bosses that they were stupid on a pretty frequent basis, and that's not necessarily conducive to long-term employment. So yeah,
No,
anyway, but
certainly not.
yeah, but a great book. Anywho, here we
Let's
are,
uh let's set
Singapore
the
Island. Yeah,
yes, let's do a sit rep of February 7th, 1942. Well, yeah, Malaya
Malaya at the
has
time.
essentially been captured. Everything is just, and the
Yep.
Japanese are poised, as I said, across the straits,
Yep.
basically ready to pounce on Singapore. Let's get the lowdown here. What are we looking at, or what are they looking at?
Yeah. So when Yamashita's army pulls up to the Straits of Johore, they have now executed an advance of about 500 miles since December, the majority of it on foot, even though there's a fair number of trucks in this army. They're all being used for, carrying supplies and stuff like that. So Yamashita's soldiers have marched this entire way. And in the course of doing that, they fought 90 battles.
Hmm.
They have rebuilt over 250 bridges. They've captured about 4,400 British vehicles, which, as I do the math, that probably roughly tripled the truck park that they had brought themselves. So
It's a lot
they
of
are
material.
fighting this campaign, yeah, with British gasoline using British lorries. This army is very, very tired at this point, and particularly the 5th and 18th divisions have really fought hard, and they are exhausted. And now they are looking at trying to figure out how to cross between a half a mile and a mile worth of open water to get onto Singapore Island itself. So, I think we had this sort of mental image of Yamashita must have come up to the Straits, very confident of victory and knowing that, the world is his oyster, and is the farthest thing from the truth. He's tired too. Um, and he's been feuding with his own operations officer, the notorious Colonel Tsuji, all through the campaign, and has just recently discovered that, yeah, sure enough, Tsuji is Tojo's stool pigeon and is sending back surreptitious reports to Tokyo on his performance. And so he is convinced that both Tsuji and Tojo are conspiring to bring him down no matter what the outcome of the battle is. And as the 25th Army's chief of staff notes, that by the time we reached the Straits of Johore, his boss was close to mental explosion.
I just got to ask, how did he like exactly pin it down that yeah,
I
Suji's a
don't know.
rat? You don't know.
I don't know. I mean, he kind of suspected that from the outset
Sure. I
because
remember you saying that.
Tsuji's reputation just within the Japanese army was that he was a stool pigeon for Tojo. Um, Intriguingly, okay, so on that note, One of our viewers is a Japanese individual who lived in the States for a number of years, and he just wrote me yesterday to tell me that his great uncle fought in the Battle of Nomonhan as an artillery officer and served with Tsuji.
Mm.
And his great uncle likewise confirmed that Tsuji was just an awful person, just a horrible human being. Um, Unfortunately for his great uncle, he was captured in Manchuria at the
Mm.
very end of the war and was executed by the Soviets in 1947 by Smersh because his great uncle had worked in intelligence. So they thought he was a spy. Anyway, but I just thought that was interesting, sort of, it's hearsay, but it still kind of corroborates the fact that, yeah, Tsuji was just not a very nice human being. So,
Now we talked, or you, excuse me, you mentioned that Yamashita, he's aware of Suji's, backstabbing, but he's
yeah,
also very aware of the situation as it may present itself on Singapore Island
yeah,
itself. Because first of all, Singapore, the city's it's a big damn city. I mean, there's a lot of
mhm,
real estate in there, and the
yeah,
last thing on earth that any military commander wants to do, unless he absolutely has to, is engage in urban warfare. Why? Because not only is that a manpower sump, that's an artillery sump, that's an
yeah,
ammunition sump, that's a time sump, my man. That is going to eat the clock up. And this
yeah,
is racing through his mind.
absolutely. Yeah. Yamashita knows that the primary advantage that he has had up to this point in the campaign is the ability of his army to outmaneuver the enemy. They've
Yes.
just done that consistently over and over again. And yeah, if you get into an urban brawl in this city, that becomes just face smashing time. And that is not going to bode well for an army that is outnumbered by the defenders of this particular island. The other thing that he is concerned about is that his own logistics are now just kind of a vapor
Yes.
trail, running back north. Um, his artillery park is not particularly large. He's got 168 barrels, mostly 75 millimeter, and he's got about 1,000 rounds for the lighter pieces, and maybe 500 for some of the larger pieces that he's got. But if you're thinking you're going to be involved in a week or more worth of high
More.
intensity combat, man, that is not a lot of shells. Just by way of comparison, during the first night of shooting at El Alamein, um, Montgomery's artillery consumed between 400 and 600 rounds in one night. And admittedly, we're the
Per,
Allies, and that's
per
how we
barrel.
roll
Per
per
barrel.
barrel. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah. That's the
So,
key.
the amount of shells that Yamashita's got in his hot little hands are much fewer than what the Western Allies would consider a good amount.
So with all that weighing on his mind, which it was, like a ton of bricks, and his men being just flat out smoked.
Yep,
He's tired. Ammunition's run, not just artillery, but small arms too.
yep,
Things are
everything.
running out. One would think that he would pause, but he does not.
Because again, the last thing he wants to do is give the British a chance to
To
reorganize, to dig
reorganize.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've been fighting with this mentality of a driving charge through this campaign, and he is going to keep that absolutely going here. He knows that as exhausted as he is, the British are exhausted too, and he does not want them to give a chance to catch their breath. So he's going to get across this strait as rapidly as he can.
Excuse me. I put this in the notes that we need to comment, on this and just how ballsy this is. The
Yeah,
fact that he is running low. We talked about the ammo, but that's a big thing,
yeah,
especially if you do end up in an urban brawl, what there is no guarantee that you won't, highly likely that you probably would. And
yeah,
you're running low on ammunition for your artillery, which is going to be a big killer in an urban battle. Let me just look at, any urban battle.
yep,
And I mean, that's gutsy. We already know he's gutsy, but this is like super gutsy. I mean, this is
yeah.
literally a roll of the dice here that he wants to continue this operation right now.
Yeah, right now. And some of this is honestly just baked into the DNA of the Japanese army, that when they get into desperate situations, their gut reaction is attack. That's what we want to do. So yeah, he's thinking congruently with the tradition of the IJA at this point. But yeah, it's a pretty ballsy decision, that's for sure.
So I want to read this quote from Winston Churchill, and we're going to talk about the
Yeah,
Brits here now.
yeah.
This is a direct quote from Winston Churchill. Quote, not only must the defense of Singapore Island be maintained by every means, but the whole island must be fought for until every single unit and every single strong point has been separately destroyed. Finally, the city of Singapore must be converted into a citadel and defended to the death. No surrender can be contemplated. That is Winston Churchill,
Winston
which
Churchill.
I wrote this in my notes, and then I looked at your book and I saw that you wrote the same thing, and I'm like, man, it's
Hmm.
very, dare I say,
Yep,
Hitlerish, very Uncle
yep,
Addy, Stalingrad, places
yep.
like that where you will defend to the death. Every man here, every mother's son's gonna die.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, Hitler had a fetish for, particularly later in the war when
yes,
city garrisons and whatnot would be bypassed by the Soviets. He would designate that city as a fortress, Festung wherever the heck,
right.
and yeah, and require that it be held to the death. As we've alluded to, this is not Winston Churchill's finest hour as a wartime
No,
leader. We are really dipping down in terms of his wartime performance. He is desperate. He is politically wounded. He knows that his own political capital back in the UK at this point is hurting, and it's you know, spoiler alert, it's only going to get worse for the next several
right.
months. But yeah, I and again, this was something that was remarked upon by the Australian histories that just, this is kind of flat out immoral, particularly with respect to the civilians that are trapped in the crossfire here. I mean, how do you expect to maintain the moral high ground in this war if you are intentionally subjecting your Asian subjects to mass slaughter in defense of something that is just militarily useless at this point? I mean, yeah, not a good look for
Not a good,
Winston.
not a good look at all. And
No.
overall, the British and the citizenry of Singapore are not well off either. I put and again, we're going to harp on morale because we do, but
Yeah.
I put this quote in here. This is from a civilian in Singapore. And she said, quote, and it was a woman. She said, quote, I came away depressed as it seemed as though we were depending for our lives on kindly but slow-witted infants in arms, unquote. And they're
Yeah.
talking, she was referring to the defenders of Malaya and i.e. Singapore specifically. And
Yeah.
she's referring to some of her own countrymen
Yes.
because this was a British woman, as well as the Indians and the Aussies as well. So this is the citizenry, as I put in the notes, they knew that the city was going to fall. I mean, there was
Yeah.
no question.
Oh, there is a question as to how long that is going to take, but
Sure,
yeah,
but
you've got a
yeah,
lot of people at this point who had been sheltered from bad news as to, what was going on up north in the Malaya Peninsula, and really didn't have a realization of just how bad things have gotten until, yeah, the demoralized forces, pour back across that causeway. The causeway is blown up on New Year's Eve, and then yeah, a week later, the Japanese are here at the gates. One of my favorite quotes out of Wilmot's book is that across the strait on Singapore Island, farce rubbed shoulders with pathos
mm,
because, yeah, there's just this, Dante-esque scene beginning to unfold on the island itself as the Commonwealth citizens are beginning to come to grips with the fact that we're trapped here, and yeah, the city is going to go down, and the people that we're counting on for the defense of the city are not looking like they're real pros. Um, yeah, so it's really not good. The British at this point have got about 100,000 troops in this island, including the newly injected British 18th Infantry Division, which has just been landed. The lead brigade from that division, the 53rd, had fought during the Battle of Muar and Gamas, which was the last, major battle. But the other two brigades have just landed afresh, along with the 44th Indian Brigade, and some additional about 8,000 Australian replacements as well have been put in at the last minute to try to, integrate with 8th Australian Division. And unfortunately, a lot of those new troops, it's not 8,000, it's about 2,000, excuse me. A lot of those troops are just, they're not very well trained at all. In fact, the majority of these troops that have just landed are not well trained. And one of the Aussie histories says that the men that they landed here were useless and but a positive menace for their lack of discipline, fitness, and training. So yeah, it's just a chaotic scene here on the island as the British are trying to throw together some last minute defenses, and put together something credible in the way of trenches and whatnot. That just it's laughable. So
Speaking of trenches and whatnot,
yeah,
prepared defenses. They ain't none, or not
they
very
ain't none.
many. Not very
Yeah,
many, anyway.
yeah, and um, that is a problem as well. That all through this campaign, there has been problems with the British civil administration, and things had gone so poorly that Percival had taken to not leaving meetings with the civilian government until the minutes had actually been signed, because he was tired of being end run by the civilian authorities. Among other things, the civilian authorities had refused him permission to dig in the golf course, because that would, it would tear up the greens, old boy. It's like, do you not understand who's just across the channel over here? It's just, yeah, it's a mess.
Foolishness.
So yeah,
So one of the myths of
yeah,
Singapore, and we got to talk because you're going to see it, we're going to hear about it, I
over and
guarantee.
over.
But Singapore has a lot of big guns, a lot of
Yeah, it
big
does.
artillery pieces, anti-shipping, big,
Yep,
some 15-inch rifles for some
15
crying out.
inch. Yep, yep.
And the theory is, the myth is they could only point out to sea and they could never crank back and fire back over the other end of the city. But that's a bunch of malarkey, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a bunch of malarkey. Yeah, so there's a number of 15-inch batteries here. I think there's like four. I'm shooting from the hip here. Forgive me if I'm wrong. There's a bunch of like 9.2-inch as well. They absolutely could be trained around to the north if need be. The problems are more mundane in that the majority of the ammunition for these guns is armor
AP.
piercing,
Yeah.
right? Because we think that these weapons are going to be used against ships. Likewise, it's one thing to be able to point your barrel to the north. It's quite another to be able to actually spot the fall of shot and adjust that fire. If you haven't got, you know, teams up north who can actually radio back to, Mr. Shore Battery that, yeah, walk it up 100 and fire for effect, they didn't have any of that, because all of that fire control instrumentation was actually hardened and in its own bunkers and was sited in such a way that it could control the seaborne approaches to Singapore. So, yeah, the issue isn't one of mechanically being able to turn around and face the right direction. The issue is one that those batteries were never put there to try to defeat a land invasion in the first place. That also points out, though, some of the faults of Percival's dispositions in this island, in that Percival maintains that there's still a danger of amphibious invasion right up to the end, which means that there are about 3 brigades worth of troops that are stationed along the southern coast of the island, which could well have been used up north to try to, bolster the defenses up there, because up north things are a mess. So we've got a map, and I think we should, throw it in at this point just to kind of, show people where things are. But what you can see is that In the northwest corner of the island, you've got the remnants of Australian 8th Division, which has, at this point, it's only ever had 2 brigades, and that's what it's got now. And these are 2 very tired brigades, the 22nd and the 27th. You've got a brigade, the 28th Indian Brigade is in the north center. That is the only remnants of 11th Indian Division that are still in the field at this point. And then up in the northeast corner, nearer to the naval base there at Seletar, you've got the newly landed 18th Infantry Division, including the 53rd Brigade and the other 2 brigades that go along with it. And, you know, the 18th is arguably the freshest unit you've got here. It has not been beaten up yet like the other units have been, but at the same time, these dudes are just fresh off the boat, have not
Yeah.
acclimatized at all, haven't done any tactical training whatsoever. I mean, other than 53rd Brigade, none of them have seen any combat. But the overall situation then is that British defenses are stronger in the northeast than they are in the northwest. And the Australians in particular have got a really tough nut to try to cover in the coastline up in that neck of the woods. There's a lot of mangrove swamps up there and these deep indented kind of, stream outlets and that kind of crap. And so, yeah, as you noted, 22nd Brigade is responsible for covering about 8 miles worth, worth of territory, which is, you'd be lucky to do that with a division. So yeah, they're not in a good way in terms of being able to defend the island in the northwest corner.
And Percival screws up putting people in what will obviously be he puts people in the wrong place, but he's advised by Wavell
Yeah,
that he's like, yeah, you probably ought to take your best guys who are the 18th Division,
yeah,
freshest guys, I should say, and
yeah,
place them here because this is the shortest distance. And if they're going to come, and we all know they're going to, it's highly likely that that's the way they're going to go.
yep,
And Percival just like, nah. And he
yeah,
completely ignores that suggestion altogether.
yeah. Which is, so I'm not a big fan of Wavell in this campaign either, obviously, and I'm really not a fan of him in the Burma campaign, which we're going to talk about as well. But yeah, this is the one time that Wavell actually kind of gets it right to anticipate that the northwest corner was going to be probably where the Japanese would land. And yeah, Percival this one time gets his way vis-a-vis Wavell, and he's wrong. So yeah, the result is that you've got this outnumbered Australian brigade, the 22nd, that is going to face the majority of the Japanese amphibious forces.
He's also working with Percival is also working with bad intel,
Yeah,
really bad intelligence. Intel's telling him that the Japanese have upwards of 150,000 men and 300 vehicles, and
yeah,
that's almost double what
yep,
Yamashita has
yep,
actually has.
yeah. And this is a persistent pattern that you're going to see all through the opening portions of this campaign, not just in Malaya but also in the Philippines. That this is the salve that people like MacArthur and Percival and Wavell all reach for, is that, oh, we were hideously outnumbered. The Japanese had, yeah, 200,000 troops in the Philippines. No, bro, they were just better than you, a lot better than you. Um, so yeah, that's not the case. The Japanese don't have nearly that many tanks either, and even if they did, how are they getting them across a mile of open water? At least in the initial stages of the assault. But I'm reminded of the quote from J.R.R. Tolkien, The Two Towers, where we're coming into the siege of Helm's Deep, and one of the Rohan soldiers there says that he who flees counts every foeman twice. And I think that's what you got going here. And there's a certain element of racism that's built in this too, I think, just explicitly that, okay, yeah, we've been getting our butts kicked, but it certainly can't have been, by an
Man to
inferior
man.
number of Japanese who are inferior to us. It's got to be these overwhelming numbers. Nope. they're just better than you are. So
Yeah,
anyway.
and so far as overinflating victorious numbers. When you're getting your plow handed to you,
Yeah,
that's a good way to cover a little CYA, cover your ass.
yeah,
Oh well, there were 200,000 of them against our 5,000. So
yeah,
anyway.
exactly.
But on the flip side of that, the Japanese
Yeah.
intel isn't great either, though, is
Yeah,
it?
yeah. I mean, the Japanese obviously don't know much about the British dispositions on the other side of this strait. Yamashita, his basic game plan is to, yeah, pick the narrowest part of the strait and just let's get her done, get across it. And he's going to use his two best divisions, 5th and 18th. 5th, again, 5th Division did the very first amphibious invasion ship to shore that the Japanese Army ever did in 1918. These guys know what they are doing when it comes to amphibious ops. And they've got assault boats and all that stuff that they've hauled down the peninsula just for this very thing. So, what he wants to do is use 5th and 18th to make the initial landing. Once 18th fights its way over to the causeway and liberates that, the Imperial Guards Division will then come down over the causeway and will then enter the action. And when he rolls that plan out in front of his three divisional commanders, a General Nishimura, who's the commander of the Imperial Guards, throws a witchy fit and demands his share in the assault. That the honor of his unit requires that he be, in the lead echelons along with 5th and 18th. And this is the one time in the campaign that Yamashita kind of blows it, and just because, and some of this may be due, I think, to the fact that he knows that just like Tsuji, Nishimura is also very tight with Tojo and will be saying nasty things about him back to Tojo unless he gets his way. And so Yamashita relents and says, okay, fine, you can have some assault boats too, and you guys are going to come in on the eastern flank of this operation, and you get to land along with us, which is dumb, but that's what ends up getting decided.
So all this starts to kick off on the 8th of February, and it
Yep,
starts off with an artillery barrage, such as it is with the limited amount of rounds that they have. But
yep,
it is fairly significant, and
yep.
Japanese air power brings the hurt down on Singapore, which, by the way, I don't know if we've mentioned this, maybe we haven't. If we have, please forgive me. They've been bombing Singapore pretty much
Consistently.
daily-ish
Yep, yeah, yep. Throughout the campaign.
since the beginning of the war, mind you.
Yeah, that's right. And by this point in time, yeah, a lot of the city has been at least damaged. Civil order is starting to break down in the city
Mhm.
as well, and it's just going to get worse from here. So, yeah, what ends up happening on the morning of the 8th, the Japanese kick off their initial bombardment, and it goes all day long. And by the time you get into the afternoon of the 8th, they have set afire a lot of the oil storage tanks at Seletar. So there's this pall of smoke that's now hanging over the island, and they've ripped up a number of the sort of the water's edge defenses pretty badly at this point. So, it should be obvious at this point to anybody with three contiguous brain cells that, yeah, the assault is probably going to go in this evening. So, yeah, that's what ends up happening.
And at about typical of Japanese, assaults at about 01:30
Yep,
in the morning, they do start to bring people ashore. And like you said, these little wooden canvas
canvas boats.
craft.
Yeah,
And they land right in front of the Australians, exactly
yes,
where
they do.
Wavell said that they would land.
Yep,
And the Aussies give a really good account of themselves, even though they've been beaten to a pulp for weeks and weeks and weeks.
yep,
They really put up a stout fight here.
yep, they do. They fight very stoutly, and among other things, they had set up in the landing zone of the Imperial Guards, they had set up some traps there where they could actually pump gasoline
Mm.
into these little inlets. So when the Imperial Guard comes over, they release one of these things and set the river on fire and just incinerate a couple companies of the Imperial Guards in their boats. I mean, it's pretty ugly. The problem is that once the Japanese manage to get ashore, you've got this really, indented coastline. And that means that once they're in there and in these mangrove swamps, it becomes really difficult for the Australians to figure out exactly where they are. And so the fighting then devolves into these, just squad and platoon sized actions. It's incredibly chaotic. And in fairly short order, the 22nd Brigade begins to fall apart, even though they do some pretty stiff fighting. And it is at that point.
That's what I was about to say. And let
So I'm just going to quote out of my book here. Given the way things had unfolded over the past 2 months, it would not have done to ring down the curtain on Percival's miserable campaign without one final wretched display of military incompetence. Brigadier Duncan Maxwell, the commander of the AIF's 27th Brigade, was duly anointed by the gods of war. And yeah, Maxwell, this guy was a doctor in civilian life. And he'd admitted to another officer fairly early in the action that he just really wasn't cut out for this sort of thing. And in fact, he had recently argued with Percival that they might as well just surrender rather than subject, Percival's beaten army to another beating and thereby hopefully save the lives of of the men. And as you were fond of saying, that went over like a fart in church. So, that's not going to fly.
not now, anyway.
Not now. So what ends up happening is that the 27th Brigade, which had been facing, the
Mhm.
northern part of its defensive sector, becomes concerned that 22nd Brigade on its left flank is beginning to fall apart, and they're expecting that the Japanese are going to be hitting them in their left flank. So what Maxwell does without consulting anybody is he reorients his brigade to face west, i.e. to their left flank in anticipation of that maneuver, only to then get caught on their flank by the landing troops of the Imperial Guard. Not only that, but by facing his brigade to the west, he then uncovers the flank of the Indian Brigade that is to his east, and he
Right.
doesn't let them know that he's doing that. So he
Yep.
has, thank you very much, Brigadier Maxwell, for completely unhinging the defenses of the northern portion of this island
Yep.
and not even letting anybody know about it. So yeah, great move, brilliant.
You didn't just screw your unit, you screwed the other two units on either side of you as
Yeah,
well. So thanks, partner. And
yeah.
I put in the notes, had he stayed in position, I'm not saying they would have beaten off
Nope.
the guards' assault by any means, but
They would have heard
they
it.
they could have hurt it pretty bad because the Imperial Guard's amphibious assault was
Yeah,
not, it didn't
not
go off very
not
well.
all that well executed. That's right. One of the problems that you've got here too, if you look again at the unit dispositions on this island, and maybe we throw the map back up there, there is no credible reserve anywhere on this island. I mean,
Right.
Percival has not reserved a brigade to act as a fire team. Everybody's up on the line. It's a classic sort of cordon defense, which means there's nothing in reserve for doing a counterattack against the threatened sector. Dumb. And so, yeah, Maxwell just makes the whole situation worse then by unhinging the defenses, and now there's nothing left to throw into the breach.
And I think that that's one of the biggest, and for me, was one of the biggest takeaways of this whole thing is that, when Percival put his people out there
Yeah,
and he set up his defensive line, such as it was, he broke the one, mass. You've got 100,000 people ish
yeah,
with which to utilize, and you've
yeah,
got them spread all over creation as opposed
yes,
to putting them in one or at least, hell, even two
yeah,
areas to where they can rapidly react to some sort of situation should it develop. And with them spread all over the island,
yeah,
you're not going to get there in time. And when you do, if you do, the
yeah,
situation's rapidly has spun out of control, which is
yeah,
exactly what happens here. And
yeah. I kind of wonder some of these units, some of these brigades, like the Second Malaya Brigade, those guys
yeah,
are
they're
not.
shot. And
Yeah, well, they haven't been engaged yet in this campaign, but they're really not all that great just to start with. I mean, the analog that we're going to use here is when we talk about the Philippine campaign, a number of the Philippine army
mhm.
divisions, the only thing
aren't.
they're good for is
Yeah.
static defense. That's all
Right.
they can do. Second Malaya Brigade is kind of the same deal. If you're going to put together some sort of a counterattack element, it probably had to be the Australians. And instead, yeah, they're right up on the line. So not so good.
No, they start pulling back, as you said, and basically in ragged files,
Yeah.
and yeah, I don't want to necessarily say running, but they're moving back with haste. And
Yes.
as they pass through the outer fringes of the city, one officer specifically described the men as, quote, quite out of control and leaderless, stating that
Yes.
they had had enough.
Enough.
They'd had enough. And as I put in the notes, when these guys start passing through town
Yeah.
and the civilians see this and know that those guys are supposed to be out there defending, and it's quite evident that they've A, gotten beaten, and B, they've had enough.
Yep.
It That's it. The morale
Yeah.
in the city, already bad, just plummets through the
Starts to
floor.
plummet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, because now you've got, sullen, angry, in many cases, drunken troops, kind of loitering in
Mhm.
the rear in Singapore. The bombing attacks are still ongoing. There are unburied bodies lying in the streets. I mean, it's really starting to become a bit of a mess at this point in time.
So on the 10th, Wavell comes back.
Yep.
10th of
Our
February.
our buddy Wavell. And yeah, because he's he's flitting around from disaster to disaster is kind of what it comes down to. He's been spending a fair amount of time over in Java trying to shore things up over there because it's pretty clear that there's going to, there's an invasion pending in Java and also in Sumatra. And he's also trying to get a handle on what's been going down in Burma, and the news ain't good there. So, I don't have a lot of respect for Wavell in this particular campaign, but at the same time, he's juggling a lot of very spiky, misshapen balls at this point, and he's not doing anything too terribly well.
Mhm.
But yeah, he comes sweeping in on the 10th and tries to, put some spirit into the command to no great avail, and he ends up sending this, um, inane telegram back to Churchill, informing him that the battle was not going well, and that while everything possible was being done to, quote, produce more offensive spirit and optimistic outlook, he could not pretend that these efforts have been entirely successful to date. So he
Most certainly
orders,
have not.
no, had not. And he orders Percival at this point to counterattack.
Right.
With what remained to be seen, and Wavell didn't have any concrete suggestions there. So anyway, yeah, that meeting doesn't go well, and once he sends his message to Churchill, Churchill immediately wires back and says there must be no thought of sparing the troops or the population. Commanders and senior officers should die with their troops. The honor of the British Empire and of the British Army is at stake.
Mhm.
Yeah.
it, as I put in the notes, and I see you disagreed, but you get this when you listen to Churchill talk, especially when you look at the speeches that he gave here in the United States and Congress and things like that, which he
Yep.
does multiple times. To me, he had this grandfatherly visage, just very kindly old English gentleman,
Yeah.
kind of funny, crazy uncle kind of a thing.
Right.
And with this message, specifically, even more so than the earlier one that I read, which was verbatim, by the way, that
Yeah.
shatters that grandfatherly image of Winston Churchill completely. And I've heard people call him a warmonger before and different things like that. And it's, kind of
I
fitting here.
Yeah. I there's nuance there, right? He's brilliant.
Sure.
He's just
Oh,
he's
yeah.
he's
Yeah.
flat out brilliant.
No question
Um,
there.
an incredible orator. Um, but I also think that I've never had sort of a grandfatherly image of the guy. I look at him as just this arch imperialist uh, with views of race along the lines, as one person described him as being basically early Kipling. So yeah, this is not a guy who necessarily cares a great deal
Clearly.
the lives of his Asian and South Asian subjects is going to be repeated multiple times throughout this war. And yeah, as I say, this particular run from like February to June of 1942 is just Winston Churchill at his worst. Desperate, scared, angry, and just yeah, lashing out at people and issuing orders that are unethical and immoral, really, in the broader
And impossible,
and
frankly.
impossible. Yeah, just stupid.
Yeah.
It's just can't.
Yeah.
So
Getting to your point about Wavell ordering or suggesting that Percival counterattack, it, with
with
what and
what?
how?
Yeah,
Yeah. And I
and
think that's something that we didn't necessarily say, or maybe we did in a roundabout way, is that at this stage in the campaign, the command and control aspect of the Brits is pretty much dead.
yeah, it's just
It
falling
is
apart.
gone. And it starts at Percival and it goes all the way down. I mean, I'm sure there were obviously good commanders here and there. I'm not saying that.
Yeah,
But by and large, there was no command and control. There was no,
yeah.
fiery leader to take the reins or nothing. Like there, it's not happening.
Well, yeah. I mean, you've got Gordon Bennett, the commander of the Eighth Australian Division. He's fiery enough, but he's incompetent, and that's another thing that that Wilmot points out that part of the reason for this debacle is just the complete and unmitigated incompetence of both Bennett and Maxwell in terms of their unit dispositions. So, in any case, yeah, there are counterattacks, but much as we've seen throughout this campaign, instead of those counterattacks going in mass with the
Hmm.
intent to destroy the main body of the enemy, they are
Right.
fed in penny packets in an attempt to restore the line. We're going to hold these static positions and keep grinding them down, which is just it's death against the Japanese army. You just can't do that against them. You have to be aggressive yourself and look to discomfit them. And playing passive defense against the IJA is just usually it's doom. So anyway,
I, I think it's fair to say too that at this stage of the fight, Percival's probably done.
yeah,
You
he's
know,
done. He
he's
should have been
done. He
relieved.
doesn't. Oh yeah, but
Yep,
he doesn't. I
but
think
with
he
who?
knows he's done, but he doesn't want to admit it, as we'll see.
Yeah,
There's a conversation later,
yeah.
but he, I, I, I think he's
We're
folded.
all going through the motions at this point. Is kind of what
Yes,
it
thank
comes
you.
down to.
Yes, yeah,
That's what
yeah.
we're doing.
All
So
right,
yeah, I mean, within a day or two, 22nd Brigade is practically destroyed.
right.
27th Brigade is not much better. And of course, as has been shown time after time, once the Japanese do get themselves lodged ashore, you are not going to drive those guys back. They are just absolutely obdurate on the defense. So I was just going to say, meanwhile, on the Japanese side of things are problematic. Um, yeah, okay, we've gotten ashore. Yay, team. But now that you're on Singapore, which isn't that big a place,
Right.
it's obvious what the shape of the campaign has to be. That Fifth and 18th Division have got to push down to the south. The Imperial Guards have got to go over, secure the causeway so that they can start getting some supplies into this island over a road. They got to rebuild some sort of a bridge there so they can start bringing in some logistics. And then the guards are going to push down that causeway due south towards Singapore, while 5th and 18th Divisions fight in from the northwest. The problem then becomes that the battlefield becomes increasingly compressed as the Japanese are successful in their drive, which means that they now have more troops packed into less frontage. And the British have still got a lot of artillery on this island and a lot of ammunition, and absolutely no reason not to use it all, which means that um, the artillery just starts killing the Japanese. Tsuji in his book notes that a lot of the bombardments that the British would put down on them were just, as he puts it, just indescribably fierce. And the result is going to be that Yamashita's army is going to suffer half of its total casualties for this entire campaign in the last week of fighting. Yeah.
Yeah, that whole fire and maneuver that Yamashita's army had
Mhm.
used all the way down Malaya
Yep.
ain't gonna work when you've got the rats trapped in the corner.
That's
There,
exactly right.
there is no way to fire a maneuver on an island when you've got everybody backed up in one area. There's
Yep.
no way to get around. I mean, there is. You could go but via sea, but that ain't happening. So
Yeah.
as you said, I put in the notes, they're just doing straightforward pushes, which is reminiscent of what the Marines, frankly, are going to do in several locations across the
Yep.
Pacific Ocean.
Yeah. This
And
is head bashing, just
yeah,
straight up head bashing. That's what they got to do.
yeah.
And the Japanese are good. They have some of the best trained light infantry in the world, and they can do this kind of stuff. But yeah, against defenders that have a lot of boom boom backing them up. Yeah, it's really really bloody. Yeah.
By the 11th of February, as I put, the situation is it's pretty anybody with two eyes can
It's over.
tell that this is over. The
Yep.
Japanese have captured the high ground, which is never a good situation. They've also
Yep.
captured the majority of the reservoirs that supplied fresh water to the city.
Yeah.
So, as I put in the notes, if Yamashita had chosen to do so, he could have just stopped there and said, we're going to wait you guys out because we got all the damn
Mm.
water. But of course, they're also taking artillery fire. But I mean, this is a bad, bad, bad situation
Yep.
for the defenders. And Percival, he had to have known that it was over, yet he still refuses to accept the fact that he's defeated.
Yep. That's exactly right. There's this infamous meeting with his divisional and his corps commander, Heath of
Heath.
3 Indian Corps, and they're basically saying, we're we're kind of done here. And Percival says we can't surrender yet. That quote, I have my honor to consider, and there is also the question of what posterity will think of us if we surrender this large army and valuable fortress. To which Heath replies, you need not bother about your honor. You lost that a long time ago in the north.
Ouch.
Crushing. And
Ouch.
they had never gotten along in any case. And yeah, I mean, there's obviously a fair amount of bitterness at this point in time.
Mm-mm-mm.
Meanwhile, yeah, as we said at the beginning, farce rubbing shoulders with pathos. By the time you get to this point in time, down in the city itself, it's pretty much 100% pathos is what it comes down to.
Mm.
There are fires everywhere due to the bombing and the artillery. You've got groups of soldiers roaming around there who should be up front fighting, and they're not. Instead, they're looting. The citizenry is panicking, and as you can imagine, any boat that is
Ugh.
anywhere in this city is now worth its price in gold. And so there are a
The
lot of
blood.
people. Yeah, that's right. And so, there's a mad scramble to try to get, um, as many of the citizens out of this city at the last minute, just as things are falling apart. There had already been some evacuations prior
Sure.
to this on proper ships. Now what you've got is kind of you know, a Dunkirk in reverse. Well, that's a myth too. Actually, the majority of the units in Dunkirk were taken off by larger vessels as well. But nevertheless, there's a lot of small craft here in Singapore that are being commandeered and loaded up, and away they go.
To what you were just saying just a minute ago, one of the last convoys that brings in reinforcements to Singapore also takes people out.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them, it's about 60-40, but it's
Yeah.
about 9,000 people that they bring out. I think that's what Rich says in his books, about 9,000 people. A lot of them are British airmen,
Uh,
RAF as well. But
yeah.
to exactly how many boats are in Singapore right now, 44. There are 44 ships, and there's
Mm-hmm.
enough room for about 3,000 people to get out right now. And
Yep.
ships, these are relatively, bigger than a
Small.
rowboat,
Yeah.
but not much bigger. And then, as you said, anything that floats, whether it has an engine or a sail, is commandeered. People are getting aboard and they're going out. And then it is just,
It's
a,
bedlam.
yeah, it's an absolute bad situation once these people get in
Yeah.
these boats, if they have enough money, frankly, to get
Right.
in them. Once they get out in the open water, most of these people aren't sailors and
Nope.
they run into Japanese aircraft, they run into Japanese warships, and it
Right.
is, A
Because
bad scene.
here's what's going down. At this very moment, Admiral Ozawa is coming through the straits here with an invasion force that is heading towards Sumatra because there's a big oil field at Palembang that they want to capture. And so, just at the moment that the city is starting to fall, or a couple days before, yeah, you've got all these small craft that are out in the straits here, and if you've got if you're on the trusty minnow, you've got this little beat, right? I mean, that's the kind of boats
Yeah,
we're
it's
talking
kind
about
of.
here, a
Yeah,
3 hour
yeah,
cruise.
yeah.
um, and so you've got this 24-foot beechcraft or whatever that's got 20 people in it. And where are you going to go? Where are you going to go? Borneo is already in Japanese hands. Sumatra is still, is the closest thing. It's just off to the southwest, but these citizens who are piling in here don't understand that the Japanese are in the process of about to invade this place. They sure as hell can't go up the Malacca Straits. That's all, controlled by the Japanese at this point. You're going to go across the Indian Ocean back to India. That ain't going to get it done. So the only hope these people have is to try to make it to um, Sumatra, and then hopefully, from Sumatra, get to the other side of that island and get across the Indian Ocean. It's desperate just to begin with. And yeah, they run into Ozawa's forces and they just get massacred. A lot of these boats end up getting sunk. So the majority of these people are not going to make it anywhere other than into the water. Bad.
On the 15th of terrible, and
Yeah,
there's several instances of Japanese, machine gunning the people in the boats. It's very evident that they're
absolutely.
civilians and they don't care.
Don't care.
They just kill them all.
Yeah,
Um, on the 15th of February, Percival, I guess he has an epiphany in the middle of the night and realizes that the jig is up. It is over.
yeah,
He calls for another command conference with his senior staff, and that's when he's told that the city or the area has enough fuel for one day, enough water left for one day ish, and artillery left in
yeah,
the stocks. And it's, he brings up counterattacks, and that dies on the vine almost immediately.
yeah.
And then
And you
he,
you can see from the map too that at this point the British perimeter has just been basically shoved right back to the city, and the Japanese have captured Bukit Timah Hill, which is Tin Hill, and that's where one of the big reservoirs is. And so
mm,
yeah, I mean it really is game at this point. And so at this point in time, yeah, Percival decides it's time to throw in the towel finally.
so he sends a message across lines, basically requesting a meeting
A
with
parley.
Yamashita.
Mm-hmm.
Let's discuss Yamashita's logistics. He's about at the
He's
end of his rope.
Yeah, he's, again, if things were a vapor trail by the time we got to the Straits of Johore, they're even vapory
Mm,
by the time we get here. Yeah, he's running out of everything. And, he's determined that he's going to have to drive in another attack this evening. But yeah, he's actually trying to kind of regroup things a little bit at this point when this parley party kind of shows up. And so, yeah, he says, basically, we'll meet you at the Ford factory, which is near Bukit Timah Hill. And that factory is still there. It's a museum, as a matter of fact. And
mm,
this leads to then a series of some of the most famous photographs of the entire war of Percival leading his party, uh, up towards the Ford factory. And with them, famously, is
mm.
Colonel Sugita, who is the intel officer for 25th Army. He speaks English, and yeah, he's along in those photographs. And fast forward, Sugita will be standing on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, and will be a witness to the surrender ceremony. But at this point in time, February 15th, no one could have imagined that in their wildest dreams.
No,
So
no.
yeah, Percival is shown into this conference room at the Ford factory. The Japanese officers who see him remark on the fact that he just looks, like a scarecrow. He's pale and thin, and he was never that inspiring a physical presence to begin with. And yeah, he's just totally gotten the stuffing kicked out of him at this point.
Yamashita, and there's video of this, and I'm think I have some, and if I do, I'll certainly put it in. But
Yeah,
Yamashita essentially, as I put in the notes, he puts on a poker face, and
yeah,
he plays his hand, like a master, and
beautifully.
starts essentially bullying Percival into. I mean, Percival really not much of a choice anyway, but Yamashita believed that Percival still outnumbered him, which he did,
What you did.
and Yamashita just starts pounding on the table and just tearing into Percival after they shake
Hmm.
hands. Just,
Yep.
like, hey, how you doing? All right, let me tell you how this is going to go, and just starts berating him up and down, and
Yep.
essentially bullying him into surrender. But he threatens that there's going to be a night attack as
Yep.
well. And let's go through that for us. How's this
Yeah.
all shake
Yeah,
out?
that's exactly. Yeah, Percival has been diddling, all through this particular campaign, kind of waffling. And so one of the requests that he makes of Yamashita is that he would like to keep 1,000 armed men to help restore order, or keep order, as it were. Yamashita thinks that that's just a ploy on Percival's time to buy more time, and he gets really frustrated with Percival, and so he ends up just pounding his fist on the table and says, there is a night attack that is going to be kicking off. I forget the exact time, and that the time for the night attack is drawing near. Is the British Army going to surrender or not? And then he adds in English, answer yes or no. So it just again, just the clash of personalities here between these two armies. Um, Whatever you may say about Yamashita, yeah, he's a fire breather, and he's definitely he plays his cards brilliantly, and he is a very gruff, combative individual, and he just basically kind of cows Percival into
Yeah,
submission at this point, and Percival throws up his hands and says, "Yeah, here we go."
yeah. And there was, I mean, there was nothing Percival could do anymore
No,
at this stage either. He could try and bide time, but I mean, it was,
to do what?
yeah, for why?
Yeah,
What? So, and we can comment on this, and if we want, but I put this in the notes, and I think it's kind of hard to argue, frankly, with the surrender of Singapore, which it
yep,
is, and we'll get in a little bit more of that in a minute. Um, the British Empire, as it has been known for centuries,
it's done.
is no more.
It's
This is
done.
it. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, Wilmot's chapter on this, he calls it sunset for an empire, and that's exactly right, because it doesn't matter at this point, win or lose. If the British manage to come back in this war and retake Malaya, it's irrelevant. They have lost the the moral.
Prestige. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They have no moral right to rule anymore, having been humiliated during this campaign as badly as they have been. And I think that that's one of the reasons that Churchill is just acting like a nitwit at this point, because he understands this too. Just from a political optics standpoint, this defeat is irrecoverable. Yeah, the British Empire can never come back from this. And certainly this, in combination with what ends up happening at the end of the Burma campaign, which we'll talk about, yeah, the British Empire has just thrown away any right to rule in Asia at this point. It's game.
So once word spreads, and as you can imagine, it don't take long
It don't take long.
for word to filter down that the game is over. There's
Yep.
further just pandemonium inside the
People.
city and around the city, and we'll talk
Yep.
about some of the massacres and the
Yeah.
atrocities in a minute. But
Right.
the guy that is, in my opinion, one of the biggest scumbags of them all, man. We talked about him last week, or actually, I forgot
Yeah.
that this airs 2 weeks after. But when we talked
Yeah.
about the Malayan land campaign, we talked about Gordon Bennett, and we mentioned him
Yep.
briefly. He bails. He flat out bails on his people. He turns around, takes I
Bennett.
don't know what, like 4 or 5 of his staff or something like that.
Yeah. He manages to get a boat, and Bennett escapes and makes his way back to Australia. Like, he's one of the
Hmm.
very few people that manages to get out of here.
Yeah,
And
he goes to Sumatra, then Java, and then on an aircraft all the way to Australia.
yeah, which when you think about it, yeah, it's pretty remarkable that he was able to make this escape. And his excuse is that,
Defense.
nobody understands how to fight the Japanese, and it's important for me to get this information out to Australia because the Japanese are going to be on our doorstep soon, which is all true. But from a command responsibility standpoint, yeah, he basically ditches his two brigades who are about to be sent into the hell of Japanese captivity. Now there is nuance here before we, and just to be clear, I think that Bennett is a tool too. Don't get me wrong,
He is a
but
jackass.
there's questions around the timing of the surrender, and if you're a POW, you have not necessarily the obligation, but certainly the right to try to escape from your
Sure.
captors. That is very much a done thing, right?
Yes.
And so Bennett, has at least some um, what permission to try to make his escape, because when does he stop being a commanding officer technically and start being a prisoner of war? And he was never physically controlled by the Japanese, and so
Right.
he takes this opportunity to get on a boat and skedaddle out of here. And I would just say that there is a very interesting um, appendix in the back of the Australian Army official histories, which talks about Bennett's escape. He's later on in the war going to be absolutely excoriated for this, and he will never hold a combat command again. But the this particular appendix does talk about the fact that there is nuance here, and that there's some sort of murky legal gray area around when the timing of his becoming a prisoner actually happens, and blah 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 blah. But the bottom line is, yeah, he abandons his men, and yeah, he's a tool. So go ahead,
I think
keep riffing, man.
technically, no, you're 100% right, and it is true that all officers have a duty to try and escape. Well, any soldier does, but I mean, it's officers have a duty to escape prisoner of war stockades if at all possible, no
Yeah,
question. But so does everybody else. But the thing is that if you're any kind of a man, if you're any kind of a leader, you don't abandon your dudes.
yeah,
And he did. And
yeah,
I'm sorry, I don't care about that
yeah.
the whole,
Nope.
I have the ability to escape, so I'm going to take it.
Right.
You said, "Peace, guys. I am gone. I'm going home. Have
Yeah.
fun. I wish you well. I'm
Right.
out. Goodbye."
Yeah.
Because he had the opportunity to do so. And if he presented that opportunity with anybody else in his command, they would have killed him to get on that damn boat.
Yeah.
And when he gets to Australia, which I find to be interesting because they don't know the circumstances initially,
Yes.
he's basically welcomed. I don't want to say as a hero, but they're like, "Oh man, wow, you got back! Wow, wow, holy cow!" And
Yeah.
he's looked at favorably
Yes.
initially,
Initially.
but then the word starts filtering back to Oz pretty quick. Like I want to say within a month or two, because he's in newspapers and all kinds of other jazz. And there's quotes of I saw this and quotes from him and all this about having heroically
Yeah.
fought the Japanese and all this other stuff. And it starts getting back pretty quick that yeah, you bailed.
He bailed.
So this whole thing, you getting back and learning how to, teaching people how to fight the Japanese, how teaching people how to get beat by the Japanese, maybe?
Right. Because you weren't terribly good at fighting the
No,
Japanese. BT
no,
dubs. Yeah.
no. And
Yeah.
Blamey, who's also not exactly the greatest human being on earth, he
Yeah.
winds up shoving Bennett into a
Bennett's.
corner for the rest of the war, and then Bennett retires in 44.
Yeah.
He's out.
Yeah. He's done, which is just as well. And it needs to be said that there are a number of the other British and Australian brigadiers who are going to do just yeoman's work throughout the imprisonment of their men to try to, keep the camps organized and
Absolutely.
keep sanitation in place. And as horrible as the experience of the Allied um, prisoners was within the larger Japanese camp system, if you look at the infamous Burma Railway, we've all seen
Hmm.
Bridge on the River Kwai, right? That's a real
Sure.
railway, right? that railway is going to cost the lives of between 12 and 14,000 common allied POWs, mostly from the Commonwealth, and between 60 and 80,000 Malayan and Burmese laborers that are dragged into that thing, and some Chinese too, and also Thai. But if you look at the relative casualty rates between these civilian workers who are dragged in as slave laborers vis-a-vis the Allied POWs, the POWs have a much lower mortality rate because the officers are keeping things organized. They are making sure that there is proper sanitation. They are making sure that
To the
latrines
best
are
of their
out.
ability. Yeah.
Yeah, and they've got some medical officers and all that stuff. And so even though about a third of these men are going to die in Japanese captivity or thereabouts, the mortality rates amongst the Ramusha, the slave laborers, is like between 60 and 80%. It's just god awful.
Yeah.
So credit needs to be given to, a lot of the British officers who really did have the best interests of their men in mind and tried to keep things orderly in the camp. And, a number of them end up dying in captivity as well. And yeah,
Yeah.
Bennett skipped.
The whole Burma Thai railway episode as a whole, that's a nightmare of biblical proportions. And a
Oh,
lot
yeah.
of the guys that are captured here, as you alluded to, in Malaya and Singapore, end up there.
Yep.
Not all of them by any means, but I forget what the percent. I used to know, but I forget what the percentage was. But it was fairly stout. That's where
Fairly
most of
healthy.
these guys go,
Yeah.
and they wither away on the vine building that damn rail line
Yeah.
for the rest of the
And
well, most of the war.
the other thing is that that railway is just one of about four
Yeah,
really
yeah.
notorious Japanese railways, and that one is actually the best of the four in terms of
Mhm.
mortality. The others are mostly built again with indigenous populations that the Japanese could care less about. And so, yeah, if you look at things like fatalities per kilometer, which is really the easiest way to measure these things, as horrific as it sounds, these other railways in places like Sumatra are actually have higher body counts per kilometer of track. It's just, anyway, god awful.
Terrible.
Meanwhile, in Singapore, what a
Worst
mess.
defeat in British military history.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
there's no arguing that, I don't
Yeah.
think.
Churchill's right on the money when he calls it that. So basically, about 120,000 men are taken POW. About 55,000 of those are Indian, and about 40K worth of those 55K Indians are eventually going to flip and end up joining the Indian National Army, which is
Mhm.
under Japanese control and is going to be, a figure in later campaigns in this war. About 15,000 of the Indians end up remaining loyal to the British and are therefore, subjected to largely the same conditions. So total British casualties for this conflict or the campaign are 138,708 men. About 18 to 20,000 of those have been killed in action, to set against the Japanese, who have lost only 9,657 casualties, KIA, MIA, and wounded in action. And as Wilmot puts here, nothing in any way can diminish the humiliation explicit in these losses. A garrison that outnumbered the attackers by more than 5-2 at all stages of the campaign had been hounded to utter destruction in 70 days, 30 days less than the Japanese themselves had anticipated. Yeah, it's a beatdown. Just a beatdown.
Absolute beatdown.
Yeah.
Absolute. So Singapore civilian population, about between 6 and 7,000 people are killed. A lot of that is during the air raid
Yep.
and the initial Japanese assaults, excuse me, via artillery. By the end of January, roughly 150 to 200 civilians were dying daily.
Yeah.
As I said, mainly through air attacks. Do we want to discuss the British battlefield leadership here and ability? Because I think it's
Actually,
been
let's
on display. That
Yeah, well, I want to do that at the end because I just want to insert.
okay.
Let's do the Sukching massacres here because
Okay.
this is something that has, you know, formed the consciousness of the Singaporean population since the time of the war. So, yeah, about 6 to 7 thousand civilians have been killed up to the point of surrender. But after the surrender, what ends up happening is the Japanese army comes in along with the secret police, the Kempeitai, and of course, there's a very large Chinese ethnic population in the city of Singapore itself. And what ends up happening is the Imperial Army ends up sort of segregating a lot of the young and middle-aged men that are ethnic Chinese, and they put them through a screening process, which is completely arbitrary and whatever, and end up taking thousands of these Chinese civilians up to the north shore of the island and machine gunning them and either throwing them in the straits or burying them or doing whatever. And the numbers are squishy. They range from between 6,000 to 50,000 killed. The lower number, as you might imagine, is the one that is generally accepted by the Japanese. I I think it was easily between 20 and 30,000. I would tend to err on the higher side. And the culprit behind this is none other than our good buddy Masanobu Tsuji, who is of the opinion that any Asian that cooperates with the British is no better than an imperialist stooge and should be put to death in any case. And obviously, the ethnic Chinese, given the fact that the Japanese are in the middle of a war with them, are pretty low on the totem pole of people that
Ripe targets, you know.
yeah. So Tsuji, along with Nishimura, the commander of the Imperial Guards, it's clear that this is something that is being planned at the staff level in 25th Army. It is not necessarily being executed with Yamashita's direct knowledge, but Yamashita is not doing his best to keep positive control over the situation either. And so, yeah, the result is thousands and thousands of Chinese civilians killed.
Much like what is going to happen 2.5 years or 2 years from now, or
Yep.
from then rather, in the city of Manila.
Yep.
I find it very difficult to believe that Yamashita didn't know that
No.
that was going down in Manila at the hands of Iwabuchi.
Mm-hmm.
I find it very difficult to believe that he had no earthly inkling, and he
Yeah.
made absolutely, as far as we know, maybe there's some document that will be unearthed, no effort to stop it in any way, shape, or form, much
Yep.
like he does here.
Yeah. And the outcome of this in the nearer term too is that Tsuji is going to get a lot of the credit for this successful campaign. He's going to go back to Tokyo. He's going to write a book. Like he gets that book out like right now, and he's going to be lauded as the genius behind the 25th Army's plan. And the result is that Tsuji is going to become sort of the Imperial Army's Mr. Fix It. And he's going to be sent to places where things are going wrong. And there is nowhere that things are going wronger in Japan's overall campaign than in the Philippines, as we talk about. I mean, when Singapore falls, the Americans are still holding out in Bataan. And Tsuji is going to end up over in the Philippines right before the Bataan Peninsula falls. And gee, I wonder if he had any impact on the staff officers on 14th Army that then ends up leading to the Bataan Death March. So yeah, Tsuji is just a horrible human, and yeah, where he goes, infamy follows. I guess I would say.
Death, murder, rape, and pillage follow.
Yep. Meanwhile, yeah, the British situation is just
It's a dumpster fire.
is
That I mean, I don't think we talked about throughout this entire 3 or 4 episodes one positive effort on the British Army's
you
effort in the
can
Malayan campaign. I mean, there's certain individuals who were better than others for sure,
yes.
but overall command, from Gordon Bennett, popping smoke and getting out of there, Percival being completely out of touch with reality,
Yeah.
Maxwell, just doing the complete ass opposite of what he should have done in any kind of combat situation.
Yep.
It's just, it's a mess. It's like
Yeah,
the inmates are running the asylum down there.
yeah. The whole campaign from start to finish is just botched from the get-go. Just again, starting at Jitra on December 11th, that's where it all starts going south in a really, in a literal and figurative sense, almost immediately in this campaign. And yeah, you don't get any sense that Percival was in any way fit to command this campaign. That his
Mhm.
he exerts no positive control over this thing from the beginning. The uh, leadership at the divisional level is just dreadful, almost uniformly. Even Paris at Slim River, a guy who had fought his brigade pretty well, and yet when he gets elevated to divisional command at Slim River, he gets waxed immediately. So the whole thing is just conducted ineptly. The and and yet there's a tendency to point fingers of blame at Percival and the divisional commanders, and there's plenty of blame to be foisted there. But a lot of the blame again needs to go back to London because it is the unreality of British strategic planning in the interwar period that is in many ways responsible for this debacle. That they don't understand what they're up against. They don't have an idea of how much they need to put into the Malayan Peninsula to actually hold it. They completely undervalue the Japanese as opponents. I mean, yada 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 yada. The list goes on.
And they had more men, they had more equipment, they had better equipment, they
Yep,
had better lines of supply,
yep,
and they being the Brits, I'm talking about, still managed to botch it, from the get-go.
yep.
You gotta believe that first beat down at Jitra, uh, that
Sets
knocked
the
the front
tone
that
a bit.
knocked the front teeth loose, and they never recovered from that. They really didn't. They never recovered from that. That punch in the mouth staggered them,
Yep,
and they never got back up.
yep. Well, and this is a point that Wilmot makes as well. I mean, the final thing though that needs to be said is that there's a lot of you know hand gnashing of teeth and all that kind
Sure.
of stuff at how badly the British have performed, which denies some of the laurels to the Japanese who rightly deserve credit
Hmm.
for running a campaign that was just flat out brilliant. I mean, as wretched a human as Suji was, he built this 25th Army just perfectly for
Hmm.
the mission it had to conduct, and then he handed this implement to the perfect guy to run this campaign. Yamashita is just a fire-breathing whip cracker, and the result is that given a sound plan, good intelligence, a tailored army built for this campaign, and the right dude at the helm, they just steamrolled, through this entire thing. It's incredibly masterful. It's one of the most brilliant military campaigns of the entire 20th century, I think you'd have to say. It's incredibly well done.
When you look at the disparity in forces between the attackers and the defenders, and as we said, the amount of logistical
Yeah.
advantages that the British had and the Japanese did not,
Yeah.
and the fact that they just wiped the table, man. I mean, just
Yeah. They
shoved them to
just
the
snap.
side everywhere they met them. Well,
Yep.
mostly everywhere,
Yep. Mostly
and
everywhere.
yeah, and just pushed them all the way, literally into the corner. Is
Yeah.
is speaks for itself. So,
Spectacular.
what does this do to the overall Japanese offensive plan right now? And
It
this is
ends up
February
accelerating
1942.
things. Yeah, and
Mhm.
in fact, even before the fall of Singapore, the Japanese have already recognized that we're operating ahead of timetable.
Times, yeah,
And
schedule.
that
Yeah.
actually is problematic because the again the shipping schedule is so intricate and complex that what ends up happening in like around the middle of January is there has to be another come to Jesus meeting between Count Terauchi, who is the commander of the Expeditionary Army,
Mm-hmm.
and some of his various army leaders. We're moving ahead of schedule here, which means we can move up the invasion of Java and Sumatra. But to do that, we got to pivot and juke and jive and jigger our shipping schedule a little bit, and they do end up doing that. So the result of that is going to be that, yeah, Java is going to end up getting hit sooner than planned, and likewise Sumatra. That's the reason Ozawa is in the channels in Singapore heading towards Sumatra, because he's been told, let's expedite things here and get out there and grab Palembang, which is the biggest oil field in the area and is honestly it represents the majority of the oil that the Japanese are trying to secure in this war. So it does speed things up for the Japanese.
I think a good way to close this is a quote from Alan Brooke.
Yeah.
It says, quote, I certainly never expected that we should fall to pieces as fast as we are. And to see Hong Kong, which we'll talk about later, and Singapore go in less than 3 months plus a failure in the Western Desert is far from reassuring. We have had a wonderful power of recuperation in the past. I wonder whether we shall again bring off a comeback, unquote.
Yeah. Yeah, because the British have, always had this ability to kind of muddle through. They're famous for losing the first battle but winning the war.
Winning the war. Yeah.
Yeah, but it sure isn't looking good at this point in the war for them. The final thing, though, we should say is that Yamashita does not come out smelling like a rose from this thing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That despite the fact that he is the victor in this campaign, a spectacular victor, the fact that he is still on the wrong side of these factional politics with Tojo, it becomes even worse because the victory is so spectacular that the last thing that Tojo wants is a guy from the other army faction like Yamashita getting all the laurels. That's one of the reasons that Tsuji comes back to Japan as rapidly as he does, because he wants to grab the limelight away from Yamashita and make himself out to be the real architect of the victory here in Malaya. And so the result is that Yamashita is basically going to be sidelined up until 1944. They send him up to, a duty station up in Manchuria that's basically doing nothing but cooling jets. So you've taken a guy who is arguably the best offensive general that the Japanese produced during this entire war, and you sideline him, and he's never going to fight again until we get to the Philippines in 1944.
And even then, he's so hamstrung with the situation as it stood
Yep.
in October 1944 that I don't care who you are, you're not
Yeah.
going to stop the tidal wave of American materiel and
Yeah.
manpower
Yeah. For
of
sure.
October 1944 in the Philippines.
Although you have to kind of, so here's a what if that just kind of came out of my head like right now. What if it's Yamashita who's in charge of 17th Army down in the Solomons instead of Hyakutake? I don't know that the results are any better, but
Eh,
maybe they
I don't
are.
I don't know. I mean, they still that would be an interesting discussion to have for sure. But I mean, you still got to get those guys there.
Yeah. Got to
And if
supply them.
yeah, yeah, not only yeah, exactly. Not only do you have to get them there, you got to feed them and you got to give them ammunition. And while we know that the Japanese do that, Henderson Field's still there,
Yeah.
and there's still aircraft flying. So I'm not sure that Yamashita does any better on Guadalcanal
Yeah.
than anybody else does because of the unsinkable aircraft carrier that is
Well,
Henderson
and just
Field.
the terrain there too. One of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that, yeah, we tend to look at Malaya, it's jungle. Guadalcanal, it's jungle. They're not the same.
No,
Malaya's got roads. Malaya's got paths. You're lucky in Guadalcanal to have just, an indigenous trail that you can move around. There's no roads there. And so, yeah, that's a whole different thing. But
if you look at the maneuvering of the Japanese army of Malaya and how fast they do things and how fast, like just time wise, and they're there. And then you look at Guadalcanal and just
whole
the
different thing.
slog
Log.
that it takes these poor devils, frankly,
Yep.
to make their way through the jungle. They get lost, they get
Yep.
separated, they get sick, they get hit,
Yep.
and it's a
Yeah.
completely different beast.
Yeah. Different tactical situation too. You're not operating under air superiority, and you have no ability to operate with armor. Again, in the Malayan
No.
campaign as a whole, we don't tend to look at the Japanese as very gifted armor practitioners, but they really bring the whole combined arms smack to bear in the Malayan campaign. You know, they've got air supremacy, they've got armor, they've got good engineers, they've got decent artillery, they've got great infantry. And you know, the combination of all of those things together is the reason that they're able to execute this campaign as successfully as they did. They're not going to be able to do that in places like New Guinea and Guadalcanal. It becomes a
Mm-mm.
very much a one-dimensional sort of fight. But
Agreed.
anyway, yeah, the only other general that I would hold up as equal to Yamashita, at least in terms of offensive activities, is the dude that we're going to talk about in Burma,
Mm.
General Aida,
Aida.
who nobody knows about, and yet this guy would turns in a campaign that is, I would argue, every bit as brilliant as the one Yamashita does, and he does it with no tanks and even fewer men. So we'll get to that one eventually.
We will indeed. Lots left to talk about.
Yeah, buddy.
All right. You
Thank you.
good?
Oh, I'm good. I love this campaign. It's just so interesting from beginning to end for me. So yeah, I'm super excited we got to do it.
All right, cool. Well, are you good?
Very good. I'm good, man.
All right, good. Cool. Well, with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching this episode of Unauthorized History of the Pacific War. We do appreciate your patronage. If you have a comment, send it to unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Paridon, and I want to thank you all very, very much for listening and or watching. John, my friend, as always.
Likewise, yeah. Thank you so much for tuning in, hanging out with us, listening to our discussion, and we will see you again next week.